which is on memory. And I said in the beginning of the course that what we see and hear and feel is largely things that we're creating from our own mind. And what we're creating from our own mind is based on our memories, things we've learned in the past. So how we interpret the world is dependent on those past memories. So our senses are very much dependent on memory, so our sensations. And before we go there, let's sort of define what memory is. So memory can be, first of all, information that is stored. So somewhere in your brain, you have the memory of your grandmother. Or it could be memory is the thing that stores it. In this case, in the case of the brain, it's the strength of your synapses. Now, learning is the process by which storage proceeds, so how you create those changes in the synapses. And remembering is how we get those changes in synapse strength retrieved. How do we find where it is? And surprisingly, remembering is still something we know very little about. If you get a chance, you should listen to this talk. The brain hallucinates your conscious reality. So it's what I spoke to you about just a minute ago, that what you're perceiving is largely what you can call hallucinations. For this author calls it hallucinations of reality. What types of memory do we have? Okay. First of all, we have working memory, which we've already covered in several parts of the course. And it's a sort of scratch pad that allows you to temporarily hold things in your brain, in particular in the frontal part of your brain. It could be storing numbers that you have to add up, the partial, to add those two numbers here. You have to store the remainders and whatnot. And when one reads, you've got to read a whole sentence and put all the words of the sentence together and analyze it, and only then do you really understand the meaning of a sentence. Just reading one word at a time and not putting it all together is meaningless, Like you never understand the text. At the same time, you have to remember the spatial location of objects. So when you're close close your eyes, I can sort of vaguely remember where some of you are, at least not all of you. And so we can reach for your mouse without much trouble. Get a sip of my juice here off to the side without much trouble. Now, the thing about working memory that is very important is that it has a limited capacity. For example, it's hard to remember more than about 9 digits. It's probably a lot less most of the time. Numbers you tend to store in terms of packets of 4. Like a telephone number, you divide it up into 3 or 4 packets. The next type of memory is long term, so things that are stored for a long time. And one of those is procedural, knowing how to do something. In this case, the picture is somebody skiing. And that includes all the skills. And you have the key thing about procedural memory is that it takes time to get it. Okay? You need to practice skiing. Not something you instantly learn. It takes practice to learn to ride a bike. And surprisingly, you're not conscious of it. Okay? You ski unconsciously. It just, you go left and right, and you ride your bicycle left and right, unconscious of what you can be thinking about, all kinds of things while you're riding bicycles. Skiing, maybe you concentrate more about where you're going and stuff like that. But while you're skiing, you're not conscious of every movement that you're making. You're just making plans of where to go and what to avoid. And the only way you know that you have that skill, like say skiing, is just going down the hill and finding out if you still have it. The only way you know if you have a skill for riding a bicycle is to get on a bicycle and try it out. Playing a piano, same thing. It starts to develop at birth. Crawling is a skill, and it's not affected by amnesia. We'll talk about amnesia later in the course. And it's stored in much of the cortex. For example, in V1 we talked about binocular cells. So the eye learns to combine information from the two eyes. The brain learns to combine information from the two eyes. The cerebellum, as we mentioned several times, is important in all kinds of motor skills, adjusting your VOR. Okay, the next one is, that's long term, is declarative memory, knowing that. So it's remembering what the representation of objects and events are, remembering the face of a friend, and it involves association. So the face of a friend, you associate that with a friend and some of the characteristics of that friend, not just what his face looks like or her face looks like, but what he is all about. And many of the things that you associate with, you can establish in one trial. You learn to remember people's faces just by seeing them once. Their names you can remember just by hearing them once. And again, one is conscious of remembering. So these pictures here of Marilyn Monroe and John Wayne, I think that was. You remember instantly, and you're conscious of remembering it. Now, it only this type of memory doesn't develop, isn't there at birth. It slowly develops, and only occurs for sure by about the age of 2. And it is affected by amnesia. So these are differences from the procedural memory. And the learning requires the hippocampus. So the thing that, why you can remember in one trial is because you have a hippocampus that allows you to store this memory in your brain. So it's like a passageway into your brain. And in one trial, the hippocampus can teach your brain what that thing is. And those memories, in large part, are stored in the underside of your cerebral cortex. So I remember the fusiform face area. I was on the underside of it, the temporal lobe. And here we have the fusiform face area. So you can see that declarative memories, knowing that, are composed of two parts. The first is somatic, okay? So that involves the actual faces and places, or the facts and concepts. So here we have, every time a face lights up, you have your fusiform face area light up. And then this picture of the Eiffel Tower lights up. Now, okay, you see this other structure to the medial side, so it's toward the middle of the brain, called the parahippocampal place area, PPA for short. And it stores all the places that we've seen in the world, okay? And then we have something more complicated, another type of declarative memory, and it's called episodic. And it sort of combines all the objects, the places, the faces, in one's personal past. So it sort of adds a timeline, like who and what, with what, where, and when. So the example here I show is, there's my three kids, many, many years ago when we visited Paris, because you could see the Eiffel Tower back there. So it's combining all these things of who they are, where they are, when we did that a long time ago. Each of them now has children about the age as you see in that picture. So that tells you that was a long time ago. So basically, episodic memory is sort of a sequence of declarative, somatic memories. Now, the areas that are activated by these memories, when we perceive these memories, are the same as those activated when we remember these memories. So the connections, when we see something, connections are formed, and those connections are also activated when we recall those things. Okay, here's an exercise for you. We'll first concentrate on working memory, and the exercise is, I'll show you a list of words, and then we'll ask you, and you're not allowed writing them down, if you can remember them. Okay, we'll start here. Okay, so now you assuming your working memory is working, you've got them all in your frontal lobe, holding them there. Did you see this word? Good. Yes, because this was the last word that you saw, and so that's the easiest one to remember. Did you see this? Ah, very good again. And that's good because it was the first word you saw, one of the earliest. The thing about working memory, I mentioned, is that it has a limited capacity. So in some of you, that word could be could have been pushed out of your working memory. If my list was longer, you may have forgotten that word. Okay, good. That, yes, we saw that, but again, it's a harder one to remember because it's not a real word. So real words are easy to remember, but sort of strange combination of letters doesn't trigger your memories as easily. So you have working memory, and you have it can hold a limited number of things, but you have sort of several storage compartments, not just one for working memory. You have one for sort of visual objects, another one sort of like faces, another one for words, and another one for spatial locations. And you can fill up this one here full of words, and these two can still be empty, and you can add to them without losing these. Okay, another test. What I'll show you sort of strange objects, or objects, not strange, but objects on one side or the other side. And your question will be whether these objects are the same or different. But you have to keep your eyes here on this X. So you'll see one over here and one over here, and they'll flash by, and you just okay. So were they the same or different? Oops. Same? Different? Yes. Oops. Not doing this right. Okay, well, there was another test. But the neat thing about it is that you can remember whether they're the same or different. And yet you saw them on your peripheral retinas. I could have showed them anywhere. And so it shows you that you store these objects not in the sort of retinotopic position that you see them in the eye, but in terms of an object-centered representation. So these objects, the eye sees them, but it transforms them and then puts them into your frontal lobe in this object-centered frame of reference. Now, working memory sort of works like this. So an action potential comes in here and goes out there, but something is maintained. Okay, this is like the reverberating circuit that you saw holding your eye position, remembering where your eye should be held. So you've got millions of these circuits operating in your frontal lobe, holding these position of where you saw an object, what the object is. And this circuit, the transmitter here, is dopamine. And it seems like dopamine has been found to be more abundant in humans than in any other primate. So we have this ability. What sort of differentiates us from other species is our ability to hold things in working memory. And you can imagine that working memory is why it's so important and why it differentiates us from other species. Because with working memory, you can make a plan. You can do something like play chess. You can decide, okay, here's my plan. I'm going to move from here to here to here and see if I can checkmate him. So you can remember all those moves. You can make a plan for what you're going to do in the future, become doctors or lawyers or whatever you wish. Now, long-term memories do a different thing. They actually change the strength of synapses, and you have sort of assemblies of neurons. Here we see these four neurons, but you can imagine that these four neurons can be located in very different parts of the brain: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, and so this part here influences this part here, influences this part here, changes connections of all these parts, and that's where your change the memory of this thing that you're putting into long-term memory is stored in those connections. And as we saw, synchrony has a big influence in producing these connections. And that's because of this MNDA receptor that is influenced by synchrony. It produces, when you have a large depolarization of this cell, that synapse gets strengthened. Okay, this is my granddaughter, my oldest granddaughter. She's 13 now, so this picture was some time ago. And what I'm demonstrating here is this represents a light flash, and this represents a sound. And I'm trying to demonstrate that neither of these are producing a blink in her. She's not blinking to either. So I'm going to demonstrate what's called classical conditioning, and it's a type of procedural memory. Okay, she blinked. And maybe some of you did. Okay, and that's because that was a puff of air, or supposedly a puff of air, represented by this person here blowing on her eye. And that always produces a blink, okay? So that puff of air represents a teacher, something that always produces a reaction in you. And a good teacher is someone that always produces a good reaction. So this is a good teacher. Okay, what do I do here to stop this? Well, I got to get my mouse over here and click it until I produce a sound every time a blink happens. Okay, at the same time. So when the sound happened, and when this puff of air came, I had to produce a sound exactly at the same time, and that strengthened this synapse because of synchrony. Okay. At the same time, this one here was reduced in strength the one from the light. So now you see the puff of air, the sound produced a blink, but the light doesn't. Okay, so we produced a reflex by procedural memory, and by the synchrony involved in that procedural memory. So you can see it involves pruning of synapses and the strengthening of synapses. And the pruning of synapses is very important because when you're learning is as much of a process of removing connections. We're born with many redundant connections that we don't really need. And when you learn procedural memories, you learn how to reduce these redundant connections. And so now we've made those connections, and you've got trillions of such connections that are formed in similar ways, and that's the trillions in you are different from the trillions in someone else, and this is what makes you unique. Now, you can have lesions, and in this case, this procedural memory was formed within the cerebellum, remember that involves forming other procedural memories. So if you have a lesion here, that learning is destroyed. Okay, here's another procedural memory. I'd like you to try to learn this. Okay, I'll play the sequence over again. So try to remember this sequence. Okay. Now try to do this faster. Now try to do this faster still. Okay. Next, try learning this one. This is a different sequence. Faster. Faster still. Okay. Now try the old one. You should have more trouble doing that. Okay. And the reason is that the second one that you learned interferes with the learning of the first one. So you can see here, we're learning one procedural memory, then learning it faster, and we hit a peak. Then we learn another procedural memory, we learn it faster, and then we hit a peak. Then we try the first one again, and it's reduced in how what we learned originally here. So this level is initially lower than this one. If we practice it again and again, you can restore it, but initially it's much weaker than it was here. So this thing interfered with this. Now, if we do it differently, so we learn the first sequence, and then we wait, and only after time we learn the second sequence. Now the first sequence is just as fast as it used to be. So somehow time is something that's important in consolidating that memory and makes it resistant from the interference that this other new sequence produced. Now if you do something else, you practice the first one, you just practice the first one again, then practice the second one. Now again, you're not as good. Okay? So what's happened here is that when you practice the first one, then you wait, you've consolidated it, so you can play it again just as fast as you learned before. Now we learn a new one, and now it interferes with the second one. Okay? So just practicing the old sequence makes those connections fragile again. So this observation is important because it not only holds for procedural memories, but also holds for episodic memories. So sometimes when you recall a memory, just when we're remembering it, it's fragile, and if something can be added to it that can change that memory, and that's very important. For example, when you're being examined in court, whether or not these memories are real or they've been made into false memories because of suggestions made at some time in your past. Now, the reason why practice makes those connections unstable is to enable you to perfect things. Okay, so when you're playing a piano or something like that, practicing over and over again the same thing with connections that are still pliable allows you to perfect that connection. Skiing repetitively over and over again makes those connections perfected, so you learn to ski properly. At the same time, reviewing this course material over and over again before the exam makes those connections, solidifies them. Another important thing for studying for exams and for these procedural memories is sleep. Okay, we practice this, then we test this, and we're just as fast because we haven't been interfered with. Then we take a night's sleep, do nothing, and the following morning we're better than we were before we went to bed. Okay. So there's something about sleep that allows you to improve on the memories that we've made. And in particular, something called slow wave sleep. It should be the most critical. It's a deep form of sleep. Now, where are these modifiable sentences located? Well, in the case of procedural memories, for example, they're all over the place. So over here, we're practicing these sequences, and you're changing the strength of connections in your motor cortex. Now, if you stick a violinist in a magnet and use fMRI to look at the motor cortex of the violinist, you will find that the left hand, the representation of the left hand is bigger than the right hand. So that's because the left hand, when you're playing, or at least you're playing violin normally, is used for the fingering. And that's much more complicated than the bow. And as a consequence, the left-hand representation becomes larger. You can tell who's a violinist and who isn't just by the representation of their hands in their cortex. The hand representation will be a lot bigger in one side than the other side. I'm also sure that if you compared my thumb representation to your thumb representation will be much larger because I have no idea how to thumb things on my iPhone, where you guys are amazing. I've watched my granddaughters use their iPhones, and I can't believe how fast they are. You can, like, the auditory cortex can also change if you practice around certain frequencies. You find that those frequencies get expanded in how much cortex they take over. And when you do things like simple things, like you can see this line has a little break in it. And with time, I reduce it. And with training, you can spot this break with finer and finer resolution. But it's neat. It's just specific for a line that when you do all this training, you're just good at lines of this particular orientation. So you've only trained one column in your visual cortex to expand, not the other. Not column, wedges or spokes of a wheel. So what's important is the procedural memories can continue to be consolidated, and that's you don't have a critical period, which is good for elderly professors. Now we'll move on to something else. We'll move on to a famous patient whose initials are HM, that a scientist called Brenda Milner in Montreal studied extensively. And that HM, because he had a head injury in his teens, started having epilepsy. And that epilepsy was very severe, and it was life-threatening. So something serious had to be done to reduce this epilepsy. And so at the age of 27, to relieve this epilepsy, surgery was done. And the solution, and surgery is still done now in some cases, luckily much fewer cases, in removing an area called the hippocampus, located here in the medial side of the inferior temporal lobe. Okay, you go. This is the temporal lobe here, and on the very medial side of it is a structure called the hippocampus, which we'll look at more carefully in a moment. And that had an expected effect, however. So after surgery, HM had still a good working memory. So he could remember you come on, you present yourself, he'll remember things about you. You can have a conversation with him. He'll remember what you just said. He had good procedural memory, so he could remember old skills, like his language was fine. He could learn new sports. He learned how to play golf after his surgery. But he had trouble. He didn't have trouble with old memories, so he could still recognize his parents, who his mother and father were. But he could remember, for example, new acquaintances. So he couldn't transfer. He could hold, when you came to his office, he could remember you. But if you walked out of his office and came back, he couldn't remember that he'd just seen you. In fact, he wrote a diary every day, as events were happening. He would write a diary. The next day, he would look at this diary and not remember a thing he had written. Okay? And the most amazing thing is, as he got older, he couldn't recognize himself in the mirror because he just remembered himself as this young man. Okay. So what he had was amnesia, but in particular, he had anterograde amnesia. So this was the time of his lesion. Things in the past are called retrograde. Things in the future are called anterograde. So he could remember, put new things like that are in working memory into long-term memory. So he couldn't form new memories, but the old ones were not affected. Old professors have trouble with this type of memory, retrograde memory. So things that I've remembered in my past are hard to recall sometimes. So H.M. died at the age of 82, and this is what he looked like when he was 27. So he would look at a mirror, and this was what he remembered himself as. And he could recognize himself. And the most remarkable thing is that as a result of Brenda Milner examining him and other scientists examining patients like him, we've discovered a lot of things about memory. And of course, he could remember any of those discoveries. He describes life as waking up from a continuous dream. Okay? So every moment was completely new to him. So for Brenda Milner kept asking him to do tests, can I test you on this? Can I test you on this? And he would say yes, because he could remember that he had done it dozens of times in the past. This was all new and interesting to him. So, how does this thing work? So we have our ventral stream, which, as I mentioned, is important in recognizing objects, and it goes largely through the underside of the brain, through your temporal lobe, and then it enters working memory in your frontal lobe. So we have these objects that we see, and we recall them here as objects in their object-centered frames. And we store them for a short time in this working memory. And then we use the hippocampus, located here in the medial side of the brain, the part that H.M. lost, to store the memory or produce the storage of this memory. So this hippocampus is the teacher in your brain, the important teacher in your brain. So when you see something, you can store it. That hippocampus, as you see here, is on the medial side of the brain. So this is the gray matter in the underside of the brain. And as you go down to the very end of this gray matter, that's where you find the hippocampus. And what's neat about this hippocampus is that unlike any other cortical region, new neurons are being formed here, about 1,000 per day. Also, new ones appear in your olfactory bulb, your smell area. And that's not a coincidence, because the hippocampus evolved from the olfactory bulb. Now you can see this is the behind view. If we look here, that's the side view. So you can see this underside of the brain. And we can see here the above view. So there's the two eyes, and you can see the hippocampus located here. Now, hippocampus is well connected. So when we see something, they're stored in different parts of your cortex, from the frontal lobe and from the parts that are activated by the thing that you're seeing. And they all get funneled into this hippocampus. And the hippocampus, after it leaves there, gets also goes back and reactivates the areas that originated the signal. But also you see this red dot forming. So it's forming new associations, activating new areas as well. So we can, when we see someone, we can remember his face in the fusiform face area, but we can also store his voice somewhere else near the auditory areas. And the hippocampus allows us to associate one with the other, the face with the voice. Then, once those memories are formed, okay, we can remember them without the hippocampus. That's very important. So when we see a face, we can remember that we can recognize that person and recall things like the person's voice without the hippocampus. So we can form these long-term memories. So HM could remember his parents, and they could remember what their voices sounded like and things associated with their past. One of the things that he was very good at doing was mowing the lawn, because he could remember where the lawnmower was, and he could remember the area around the house. And so one of the chores that he loved to do was take out the lawnmower and mow the lawn. But the hippocampus, what's important to remember is that the hippocampus is not where the memory is stored. It's just the tool used to store that memory. So the memories are long-term memories are stored in areas of the ventral stream that are first activated by the perception of the sounds or the objects we see Now, and again, one of the examples that an author, Proust, uh, wrote about was that when he ate a cookie after dipping it tea, it regenerated within him all kinds of memories of the past. So a taste and a smell uh, through the through get associated with a stream of memories from your past, and maybe a lesion in one part of memory will cause you to lose one particular aspect of those memories, but not the whole thing. Now, the hippocampus is also good at remembering, allowing you to navigate. Remembering how to get home. What's the route for taking the bus home, or walking home, or driving home? And one example of them is place cells in rats, and they allow you to associate, these place cells allow you to associate uh, combinations of visual, auditory, somatosensory, and olfactory cues in the rat. So to test this, what experimenter used is this water maze. Okay, the water maze is like a swimming pool with water in it, but you add some sort of milky substance, so you can't see anything that's under the surface of the pool. So first we add the water and the milk, and then we surround it with visual objects, and we put a underneath the water, we put uh, a little um, stand, that platform that the, the rat or mouse can stand on. And then we drop a rat into the water. And when we do that, the rat will swim around because it doesn't like uh, water too much, but rats are good swimmers. And if they're good, they'll find this platform. Okay? The next time we put them into the water, the rat will immediately head for where the platform was, so he can remember the platform from these landmarks. So he can associate these landmarks with the location of the platform and swim directly to the platform. So these place cells are like, you find that their firing rate increases as the rat heads for this platform. So on subsequent days, the rat can find it um, with, without even uh, the, the hippocampus. But if you put a rat in such a maze without a hippocampus, that rat will not learn the location of the platform. But like HM, if the rat learned where the platform was, and then you lesion the hippocampus, the rat will swim directly to the platform. Okay, one other thing about working memory and things that are stored. When you, for example, hear the sound of a telephone that's stored here, in working memory, and it's recognized as the sound of a telephone by all these auditory structures that we have. And then when we see a scene around you, that is recognized by all these other structures as being your house. And when those two things combine, well, a telephone's ringing in my house, I should pick it up. So that's why how this working memory is important in making decisions. If, on the other hand, you heard the sound of a telephone, but you saw that you were in a friend's house, your decision would be not to pick up the telephone. Okay, so the working memory in your frontal lobe is very important in making these types of decisions. This is a simple decision. Playing chess would be more complicated decisions. The last thing I'd like to talk about is another structure called the amygdala, which in some ways is important in memory because it adds a sort of a feeling about objects. And this amygdala can store fear, like the sight of a lion. And in this next example, I'd like to show how we learn to sweat every time you see a blue thing. Okay, we showed a subject different colors, but every time it's blue, we do this sound. A foghorn would be. These are pretty good speakers, so that it's much better speakers than I used to have down the medical science building in previous years. Might even have produced a sweat response in some of you. Anyways, so in a normal subject, then by training you to fear this blue light that appears in front of the screen. Oh, imagine the whole screen being blue rather than a small little rectangle here. You would every time see a blue light, you'd possibly produce a sweat response. Now, a patient with an amygdala, with a lesion of the amygdala, wouldn't learn to produce a sweat response to a blue light. So, because he has no association of fear with this loud sound. It is the sense of fear that produces the sweat response. But a lesion of the hippocampus would produce a very different effect. If you had a lesion of hippocampus, but not the amygdala, you'd still sweat every time you saw the blue light, but you wouldn't know why you sweated because you have no memory of that association. So the amygdala is important in consolidating the autonomic responses to stimuli, sort of emotional tone, fear, pleasure. Also, it gives you a sense of familiarity that you've seen this in the past. The amygdala is also important in activating via the adrenal gland the release of hormones like epinephrine, and that is related to improving your responses to stressful situations. It increases your arousal. Now, remember the recognizing faces and amygdala. So often when we recognize faces, we have a sense of familiarity, sometimes before we even recognize the face. So this face is familiar because the our sort of unconscious responses, the sense which is sort of the familiarity, can happen before we recognize through the fusiform face area who that person is. These connections are much faster than those connections. Now, what happens if you have a lesion? If you have a lesion, for example, to the fusiform face area, well, we've talked about this before, prosopagnosia. So you can't identify who it is that you're seeing here. You can't identify that this might be your father or this might be your mother. If, however, you have a lesion of the amygdala, you can recognize that this is your mother and this is your father, but you have no sense of familiarity. So there's a description of this one young man after a car accident had a lesion of his amygdala. And because these faces didn't produce any sense of familiarity, he complained that his parents had been replaced by aliens. Okay? So he thought aliens had taken over his parents' bodies. He had no sense of familiarity, even when he looked at a photograph of himself. But again, this was by vision. So he recognized his parents' voices on the telephone. Okay. Next, so as the last thing is I'm going to show you a bunch of faces. And I want you to hit your hand on the table every time it's a face that's familiar. Not fast enough. Oh, Margaret Thatcher, you didn't recognize. I've got to update my pictures to up a decade or two. Anyways, so you notice that you can recognize faces very, very fast. So your ability to recognize a face comes through the brain, and they appear different parts of the retina in fractions of a second. And each image activates millions of ganglion cells depending on where the object lies, but and not never exactly in the same sets of ganglion cells at the same time, but somehow it manages to activate the same unique group of neurons in your fusiform area each time for that same person. And somehow that elicits, within something like 100 milliseconds, a sense of recognition that who that person is. So how we remember these things, how this whole thing occurs, is largely a mystery. And I hope that some of you become interested in questions like this and go on to study things like the brain, which is a fascinating area. And that's it. Thank you. And I enjoyed this last 12 weeks of lectures. Good luck in the exam.